More Ezekiel 38 through 39 stage setting? Hey guys, Britt here. Welcome to End Times Bible Prophecy. Are we witnessing the stage setting for the Ezekiel 38 through 39 Gog of Magog invasion? We've talked in the past about recent events that had the potential to create the tranquil conditions we read about in Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 11. And now we're seeing events which are leading to the increasing isolation of Israel on the international stage. All of these things put in place the conditions that point to stage setting for the Ezekiel 38 through 39 Gog of Magog invasion, and that being set to take place in the very near future. So what am I talking about here? Well, let's start with this right here. This is from The Guardian. It says the European Commission calls for freezing of free trade with Israel over Gaza. EU executive also seeks sanctions on 2 Israeli ministers, but may struggle to secure majority approval required. So we're seeing great pushback against Israel, anti-Israel sentiment all around the world, but especially in the European Union. It says the EU executive has called for a suspension of free trade with Israel and sanctions on 2 far-right. Again, this is supposed to be, a newspaper article, it's supposed to be journalism, but they always put these adjectives in that are unnecessary. Why don't you just say on 2 Israeli ministers? Or too controversial if you're going to use an adjective, but they have to say far-right. Israeli ministers in response to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Ursula von der Leyen had already floated the proposal to suspend the trade parts of the EU-Israel Association Agreement last week as the European Commission faced intense pressure for greater action amid criticism that it was not using its economic leverage to influence the Israeli government. There is, however, no certain majority from EU member states for the proposals outlined on Wednesday because Germany, one of Israel's key allies, has long been reluctant to take such steps. The proposals include suspending Israel's preferential access to the European market by reimposing tariffs on some goods and freezing mutual benefits related to bidding for public contracts and the protection of intellectual property rights. And as we scroll down, we find out what all that means. It says the EU is Israel's largest trading partner, accounting for 32% of Israel's worldwide trade in goods. The EU-Israel Association Agreement formalized in 2000 underpins the £59 billion or 68 billion euro trading relationship and increases cooperation in research, environment, and energy. So guys, we're seeing great pushback to isolate Israel, to punish Israel for simply responding to the vicious attacks that took place on October 7th. And we see more like this. So this headline says, Spain pulls the plug on $823 million Israeli-backed rocket launcher deal. It says Spain appears to have canceled a 697 million euro or $823 million contract for the acquisition of the high mobility rocket launcher system developed from Israeli firm Elbit Systems' precise and universal rocket launcher design. A cancellation notice published by Madrid's procurement agency last week does not provide an explanation for the move, but it sits in line with Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez's decision to accelerate approval of a royal decree law consolidating an existing arms embargo against Jerusalem. The move is one of 9 actions the Spanish government says it plans to take to help, quote, stop the genocide in Gaza, pursue its perpetrators, and support the Palestinian population. Once adopted, the decree will establish a legal and permanent ban on the purchase and sale of weapons, ammunition, and military equipment to Israel, Spain's central government announced last week. And of course, what they just canceled wasn't Spain selling things to Israel, it was Israel selling things to Spain. So they're only harming themselves, but this goes on. We have this from Zero Hedge. It says Netanyahu admits economic isolation as more European leaders talk arms embargo. So we're really seeing the European Union push back against Israel, wanting to isolate Israel militarily, economically, and diplomatically. It says on Monday, a group of 325 former EU ambassadors and senior officials submitted a letter calling on the United Nations General Assembly to impose sanctions on Israel. This is in response to the devastating civilian casualties in Gaza and expansionist policies in the West Bank. The letter urges the UN Security Council to, quote, adopt sanctions against the multiple violations of international law being perpetrated daily by the Israeli government on the people of Palestine. This is not going to advance, of course, given that the 5 permanent UN Security Council members of China, France, Russia, UK, and US are not going to approve it, especially not the United States. Each have veto power over such sanctions, but Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu has increasingly acknowledged Israel's growing economic isolation, especially regarding Europe, as he did in fresh Monday comments. Quote, Israel is in a sort of isolation, Netanyahu admitted before the conference of the finance ministry's accountant general in Jerusalem. We will increasingly need to adapt to an economy with autarkic characteristics, he continued, using a term signifying the pursuit of total economic self-sufficiency and domestic reliance. He said this is, quote, the word I most hate. Now, of course, that's total economic self-sufficiency in this world from a national standpoint. It's unobtainable, in my opinion. He says, I'm a believer in the free market, but we may find ourselves in a situation where our arms industries are blocked. We will need to develop arms industries here, not only research and development, but also the ability to produce what we need. While the Trump administration has expressed it will continue its ironclad security support, Tel Aviv knows it cannot always rely on Washington. Given in any era there could be a new administration in the White House, and future policy could shift drastically, as it is doing among several EU states. So guys, this is the key right here. Tel Aviv knows it cannot always rely on Washington. We see things change from administration to administration. But ultimately, we could see the United States as a whole, regardless of administration, drift away from its position as the primary ally of Israel, or at least the primary ally here on earth. So God is Israel's number one ally. We know from reading the Old Testament that God promised to bring the people back into the land of Israel, just as we have seen happen in our day and time, and form the modern day nation state of Israel. It's God's hand that did that. So Israel is not dependent on any worldly alliances in order to maintain that. They have God behind them in doing that. But guys, we see this is exactly what we would expect to see the conditions being on the ground just prior to the Ezekiel 38 through 39 war. So at the beginning of this, I mentioned Ezekiel 38, verse 11. And if we go and read the original language for that, we read this. It says, you will say, I will go up against a land of unwalled villages. I will come against a tranquil people, meaning quiet or undisturbed, who dwell securely, all of them living without walls or bars or gates. So this tranquil state that Israel will be in is something we have certainly not seen since the formation of the modern day nation state of Israel in 1948. We do not see it today. However, since October 7th, we've talked about how we are seeing Hezbollah significantly weakened, Hamas significantly weakened, even weakening of Iran. So if Iran and all of its proxies eventually become no longer a threat, I believe that we're not there yet, but and that's why I believe we'll see the war between Israel and Iran ramp up highly likely before the end of the year. Exactly when, I don't know, but right now Israel has an open window with the Trump administration in power, and with the air defenses of Iran in a weakened state, to be able to try to carry out regime change, try to meet its goals in weakening Iran and its proxies. But regardless of how that happens, at some point it will happen, because we just read here in Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 11, that there will come a day in the near future where Israel dwells in the land securely, in a state of tranquility, of undisturbed peace. And that is when the Ezekiel 38, 39 Gog of Magog invasion will take place. And when that happens, no worldly power, no other nation state comes to Israel's defense. However, God does come to Israel's defense. And so we're seeing right now the world increasingly isolating Israel, turning against Israel. We've seen a rise in anti-Semitism across the world. And so we're seeing the conditions being put in place right now where we have an increasingly isolated Israel on the international stage, where that is the exact condition we would expect to see prior to the Gog of Magog invasion we read about in Ezekiel 38 through 39. So I think this is just more stage setting for that war set to take place in the very near future. Now, that said, I don't expect that this war will take place tomorrow, or this invasion will take place next week, or even in the next few months. But what I do expect to see is those conditions to come into place. There's nothing saying the rapture of the church doesn't take place before this war. I don't believe this war is a tribulation event. That's my personal opinion. But I believe that it's highly likely the rapture of the church occurs before we see this war. And of course, we know that this war occurs, I believe, before the tribulation period. So all of this tells us how close we are. When we see all these signs that Jesus and the prophets said to look for, and we're seeing the conditions start to be put into place for this war to take place, guys, that's telling us Jesus is right at the door. Jesus told us, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, when you begin to see all these things take place, know that I am near, I'm right at the door. Jesus is right at the door. So do everything you can to share the good news about Jesus and the hope you have in him with someone today. So guys, let me know what you think. Leave your comments below, and God willing, I'll see you on Friday.